Today on Council of the Rings, I'll walk through 5 common misconceptions about the Nazgûl, the dreadful Ringwraiths under Sauron's service. So let's jump right into it with number 5. 9 Kings of Men. Many falsely believe all 9 of the Nazgûl were kings of men, powerful kings selected by Sauron to gain as much influence in the world as possible. But that's not actually the case. They were not actually kings of men, or at least not all of them. The misconception mainly comes from Peter Jackson's adaptation, where we see 9 men, each with a crown, and later Aragorn in Bree states that they were once men, great kings of men. So who were they really? We know that 3 of them were corrupted lords of Númenor, and one of these would become the Witch King. Camul is another named Nazgûl, believed to have been an Easterling, but it's unknown if he was a king or not, and also if Camul was his name back then, or a name given to him while being one of the 9. The last 5 Ringwraiths we know nothing of, sadly. But it said the rings made the men kings, sorcerers, and warriors. So based on that, it should be clear that far from all of them were kings. And neither is it stated that those that became great kings were kings to begin with. Perhaps they carved out their own kingdom with their newfound powers. We can only speculate. But let's move on to the next. Number 4. Neither living nor dead. Another line from the films that have also caused a little confusion. Same scene, by the way. I guess you could say Aragorn is right in a way, but it really depends what you mean by it. To better understand this, we first need to talk about some pretty deep lore. Roa and Fea. A normal being in Middle-earth would normally have a Roa, a physical body, and a Fea, a spirit. So when you died, your Fea would leave your body. If you were an elf, it would go to the halls of Mandos, and if you were a man, it would go to some unknown place only Eru knew about. A sort of heaven, if you like. So in order to exist properly in the seen world, the union of Roa and Fea would be needed. But that wasn't always the case. So let's take a quick look at 4 examples where there is no Roa, but only a Fea. The Oathbreakers, also called ghosts, were cursed men. They had sworn an oath to help Isildur against Sauron, but when the time came, they didn't fulfill their oath, and so Isildur cursed them. Their Fea wouldn't go to Eru, but instead linger in Middle-earth until the oath was fulfilled. Another example is the Barrow-wights. There's a lot of misconceptions about these creatures too. In reality, it was evil spirits that possessed the bones of the dead. We also encountered the Dead Faces in the Dead Marshes, also called Candles of Corpses. Many Tolkien scholars believe that these were spirits that lingered in Middle-earth as well, after the Battle of Dagorlad, during the War of the Last Alliance. Men, orcs and elves that for some reason still lingered in Middle-earth. It is known that elves could refuse the call of Mandos, but we can only guess if that's the case here. And the 4th example is of course the Nazgûl, so let's try and dive into that. When the 9 men accepted their rings, they were still mortal men with a physical body. But as they wore their rings, they slowly faded into the unseen world and lost their Roa. We know that Sauron had control of their will and that they served him blindly. Their physical presence in the seen world depended on the cloaks that Sauron had given to them. Without them, they wouldn't be able to do much. When you normally think of wraiths, you probably imagine they fly around, or perhaps they can teleport around. But that's not actually the case here. These wraiths were still bound to the physical world, in a way. And we even have an example of this in the Lord of the Rings. The Nazgûl lost their cloaks at the Fort of Bruinen, and had to walk back to Mordor to gain new clothes by their master. In the films, it seems like the Fellowship is formed in Rivendell in a couple of days, but the Nazgûl lost their cloaks at the Fort of Bruinen on October 20th, and the Fellowship will first journey south on the 25th of December. So plenty of time for the Nazgûl to walk home to Mordor and gain new garments. Number 3. They cannot die. Being a wraith can give the impression that they are immortal in a way, but that's not exactly the case with the Nazgûl. The prophecy of Glorfindel predicted that the Witch King would not be defeated by men, but instead, we all know he was defeated by Éowyn, a woman, and Merry, a hobbit. It would be a bit anticlimactic if this wasn't the end for him. Many have believed that the Witch King could actually return though, based on the line in The Return of the King. Shapeless they lay now on the ground, torn and tumbled, and the cry went up into the shuddering air, and faded to a shrill wailing, passing with the wind. A voice bodiless and thin that died, and was swallowed up, and was never heard again in that age of the world. Now the last line seems to imply that the Witch King's voice was heard again in a later age, but the end of the Witch King is further backed up by one of Tolkien's letters, his letter to Eileen Elgar from 1963. The Witch King had been reduced to impotence, as stated in the bottom of the letter, and the other 8 Nazgûl were caught in the firestorm of the eruption of Mount Doom, and were all destroyed as well. But let me know if you want me to make a video about the possibility of their return in a later age. Number 2. They weren't wearing their rings. So many fans think that the 9 rings were in fact worn by the Nazgûl in the Lord of the Rings. There is actually one mistake at the Council of Elrond, where Gandalf says, "The 9 the Nazgûl keep." So you are forgiven if you believe this. But there are also several lines in Tolkien's works that tell us the exact opposite. This mistake mainly stems from the fact that Tolkien changed his mind on the matter, and simply never corrected this tiny mistake in the chapter. So Sauron actually kept their rings, most likely in Barad-dûr, and if so, they were most likely destroyed in the downfall of Sauron when the One Ring was destroyed. And even if they weren't, they wouldn't have been useful after the One Ring was destroyed anyway. And the last one. Number 1. The rings were not made specifically for men. The Lord of the Rings starts with the famous poem about the rings. 3 rings for the Elven kings under the sky, 7 for the Dwarf lords in the halls of stone, 9 for mortal men doomed to die, 1 for the Dark Lord on his dark throne in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie. 1 ring to rule them all, 1 ring to find them, 1 ring to bring them all and in the darkness bind them, in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie. Now when we read this, it sounds a lot like 3 rings were made for elves, 7 for dwarves, and 9 for mortal men, but that's not actually correct. If you dive into the lore, we learn that all the rings were in fact made by elves for themselves. The rings that were given to dwarves and men were forged between 1500 to 1590, Second Age, along with other lesser rings. These were all made by the Gwaith y Myrddin of Eregion, with the help of Sauron of course. The 3 rings were made by Celebrimbor in 1590, after Sauron returned to Mordor. And lastly, the One Ring was made in 1600, so it took around 100 years for all the rings to be made. Not to mention, the elves only made the rings after Sauron, as Anatar, had tricked them into it. They were made to preserve the powers of the elves and protect their realms. Now the 7 and the 9 were taken by Sauron in 1697, and was first later that Sauron gave out the rings to dwarves and men. So when you know all that, it becomes clear that the Ringwraiths was first made much later. Now this also means that the 9 rings weren't exactly meant to enhance the powers of men, but instead to help the elves preserve their powers. Sadly we don't know what powers the rings granted, but the Witch King seems to have had some magical powers. It could be because of the ring he once held, but it might also be because he is simply a powerful sorcerer. I think that's more likely, especially when we consider he doesn't even wear the ring. And that was my top 5 misconceptions about the Nazgûl. Did you know all these, or were there some surprises here and there? Let me know in the comments. Special thanks to all the patrons and members of the channel. Please consider visiting Patreon if you like what I do here. If you want to know the real story about how the Rings of Power were made, you might want to watch this video next. As always, thank you all for watching and being part of the Council of the Rings. Farewell till next time.